Hey guys, tonight we slip into sandals you definitely didn't order from Amazon and walk toward the slow moving giant that ruled every Egyptian's fate, the Nile. You hear it before you see it, the deep gurgle of water pushing against reed lined banks, the croak of frogs in chorus, and that thick smell of wet clay, both promising and a little threatening. Imagine trudging across the baked earth, dust sticking to your ankles, only to step onto a riverbank where the ground suddenly turns soft and rich. This isn't just scenery, it's the difference between feast and famine. And if you think your landlord has power over you, try living in a place where the river's mood decides if you'll eat bread or gnaw on air. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there on the bank, toes curling into damp mud, eyes widening at the sight of water creeping up, higher and higher. The sun glints gold across the surface, but your farmer's instinct, or maybe just your anxious side, can't help but wonder, is this the gentle kind of flood that leaves fertile silt, or the angry kind that sweeps away goats, houses, and any chance at a decent harvest? Egyptians lived with that yearly uncertainty, the inundation, they called it, arriving between July and October when rains in faraway Ethiopia sent torrents rushing north. Here's a mainstream fact to anchor you. The annual flood was so reliable that the Egyptian calendar itself was built around it. 3 seasons: Akhet for flood, Pere for planting, and Shemu for harvest. Without that rhythm, the world simply didn't turn properly for them. And here's your quirky tidbit. Villagers sometimes swore they could smell the coming flood days before it arrived, as if the river exhaled a damp, metallic breath. Imagine claiming superpowers because you sniffed the Nile like some giant weather dog. But survival was serious. Grain surpluses filled storehouses, kept pharaohs on their thrones, and fed giant pyramid projects. Too little water, and you faced famine. Too much, and mud brick villages melted into soup. Historians still argue whether ordinary farmers trusted their own eyes more than priestly predictions. Did they stand on the banks muttering, "Looks like 7 cubits this year," while priests in temples scribbled mysterious notes? You step closer and feel the pull. The Nile isn't just a river, it's a mirror. Stand at its edge, and you see your reflection wobbling with each ripple, as if your life and the flood's rise are woven together. And to be fair, they were. Taxes, festivals, even whether Pharaoh's popularity soared or tanked, all rose and fell with this muddy tide. You might laugh today, but back then, your best bet for a stable future wasn't a retirement fund. It was hoping the river chose to behave. The sound of the current deepens. Villagers huddle near you, whispering. Children chase each other along the bank, giggling until an elder hushes them with a stern glance. Everyone's eyes flick nervously toward the waterline. Will it stop here? Will it climb higher? The suspense feels oddly familiar, like waiting for exam results. Except your grade decides whether your entire village eats. And spoiler, no one ever studied hard enough to sway the Nile's mood. The first glimpse always carried drama. Some years, the river rose fast, tearing reeds loose and sending fish flopping onto the banks as easy snacks. Other years, it crept so slowly you'd wonder if the gods had forgotten Egypt entirely. You picture yourself dipping a toe, feeling that cool rush, then jerking it back because, oh right, crocodiles. These toothy beasts lounged nearby, symbols of divine power and living reminders to keep a respectful distance. Ancient wisdom tip: sunscreen, back then sometimes included crocodile dung. Yes, really, remember that. It'll come back to haunt you later. And as twilight paints the river purple, the villagers around you light small oil lamps. Flames flicker in the breeze, their reflections trembling on the rising water. A priest clears his throat, raises a staff, and declares the flood's arrival. It's official. The season has begun. Your stomach knots, not just with hunger, but with the eerie realization that this one natural event will ripple into every aspect of Egyptian life, from bread prices to temple ceremonies. You can't help but think, if you wanted a simple existence, ancient Egypt was not your best booking choice. The Nile glistens under the moon, whispering promises and threats alike, and there you stand, bare feet sinking deeper into the mud, ready, or maybe not, for the long months ahead. You're still standing on that riverbank, your toes wriggling in the wet clay, when someone tugs your sleeve, a wiry farmer with lines carved deep into his sunburned face. He doesn't need to say much, just gestures at the water. His eyes tell you everything. This flood is not just a natural event, it's life's ultimate boss fight. If the Nile rises kindly, there'll be wheat for bread, barley for beer, flax for linen. If it sulks and shrinks, fields turn to dust, and children's stomachs ache. And if it comes in roaring, villages drown like sandcastles at high tide. Suddenly, your Netflix password doesn't seem like the most important thing anymore. This is why floods mattered. The entire economy, social order, and religious confidence of Egypt was strapped to the Nile like a nervous passenger on a boat with no steering. Here's your mainstream fact. Ancient records show that when the floods failed, so did dynasties. The Old Kingdom collapsed in part because the Nile decided to play hard to get for several seasons in a row. Pharaohs could claim divinity all they wanted, but nothing shredded their credibility faster than empty grain bins. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages supposedly marked flood years by how many frogs croaked at night. Low frog noise, bad flood; high frog noise, maybe too much water. Imagine if your national economy depended on amphibian karaoke. As you lean on a palm trunk, you overhear talk of taxes. Yep, survival wasn't just about eating, it was about keeping the state machine fed. Every ear of grain Pharaoh demanded hinged on flood levels. You begin to grasp the tension. When the Nile rose, hope rose, but so did government expectations. The river is generous, meant the tax collector will be generous too, generous with his demands. Historians still argue whether villagers genuinely trusted the river as a benevolent deity, or whether they saw it as a temperamental monster best managed through rituals. To you, standing here, it feels like both. The gentle slap of water against the bank is soothing, but the roar of hidden currents sounds like a threat muttered through clenched teeth. The farmer beside you scratches his beard, then points to the horizon. You see the floodplain stretching wide, shimmering under the moon. Imagine waking up each morning to watch your world disappear under a brown tide, and instead of panicking, you're supposed to believe this is a good thing. That takes a level of trust You probably don't even give your Wi-Fi router. Still, trust they did. Entire villages gathered, not to flee, but to celebrate the arrival of the flood. Kids splashed. Women carried baskets to catch fish. Men muttered prayers. The inundation wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the heartbeat of their year, the moment when everyone, rich or poor, held their breath together. One old woman tells you a story. If the floods rose too low, the goddess Isis was displeased. Too high, and it was Seth stirring trouble. Right in the middle? Osiris smiling on his people. Suddenly, you realize that floods weren't just weather. They were divine Yelp reviews. You watch lanterns bob along the shoreline as priests pace the water's edge, murmuring chants. You can almost taste the tension in the air, thick and humid, mixing with the scent of lotus blossoms drifting down from nearby ponds. A boy beside you whispers, "If the river climbs 12 cubits, we'll eat. If it climbs 20, we'll feast. If it climbs too high, we'll swim." He giggles nervously, then quiets when his father frowns. You shift your stance, the mud sucking at your heels, and realize that in this world, there's no plan B. The Nile is plan A, B, and C. The weight of that sinks in heavier than the dampness creeping into your tunic. Floods didn't just water the crops, they watered the entire system of belief, taxation, and social order. And as you glance at the rising tide, glowing faintly under a hazy moon, you can't help but think, if the river ever had an off year, Egypt itself might unravel. And yes, spoiler alert, that actually happened more than once. But for now, in this moment, you stand among villagers, gripping hands, listening to the Nile whisper promises that might or might not come true. You're still on that bank, mud squishing between your toes, but the crowd has thinned. By morning, the farmers shuffle back with tools, nothing fancy, just sticks, poles, and the occasional rope. You notice the way they jab these sticks into the ground near the water line, marking little notches, shaking heads, muttering to each other like gamblers inspecting dice. Early trial and error. That's how they first tried to predict the Nile's mood swings. No stone shafts, no carved columns yet, just villagers crouching at the edge of a river, poking and hoping. A mainstream fact for you. Before sophisticated measuring devices, Egyptians relied on direct observation of the banks. They compared each year's water stains on mud walls, or how far the current crept up toward temples and fields. In other words, they treated the riverbank like a giant, messy notepad. If the water touched Grandma's rock, they'd nod knowingly. If it swallowed Uncle's tree, panic began. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some farmers tied gourds or wooden bowls with string, tossing them into the water as makeshift floating gauges. The idea was simple. How far did the little bobber drift before the string ran out? Congratulations. You've invented the ancient version of a pool toy mixed with a measuring tape. As you watch, you realize the river isn't exactly cooperating. Sometimes currents drag the sticks sideways, making depth readings wildly inconsistent. And when crocodiles decide to patrol the shoreline, well, good luck getting close enough for precise data. You picture yourself explaining that to your boss. Sorry, couldn't deliver my report. The crocodile ate my homework. Historians still argue whether these crude methods were systematic at all, or just hopeful gestures performed because, well, you had to do something while waiting. You can almost hear the scholarly debates. Were early Egyptians proto-scientists, carefully logging water levels, or were they simply going through the motions, convincing themselves the gods might appreciate the effort? The sun rises higher, and you squint at the river's glossy surface. Farmers jam another stick into the bank, mark the wet line, and then scratch their heads when the level seems lower by afternoon. Evaporation, seepage, trick of the current, nature keeps trolling them. One man swears the gods are testing their patience. Another insists he heard from a cousin's cousin that in Thebes, priests have a magic well that reveals the flood before it even arrives. He's half joking, half deadly serious, and the group falls silent at the thought of a place where the Nile can be tamed. Still, here you are, surrounded by improvisers. Kids collect pebbles and line them up like a little scale of river moods. One pebble high means me harvest. 3 pebbles high means bake extra bread. 5 means start building boats. You chuckle, but deep down you get it. When your life depends on muddy water, you grab any metaphor, any ritual, any rock that helps make sense of it. And then comes the sarcasm-worthy moment. A farmer slaps his thigh and claims he can tell the flood's height just by listening to the croaking of frogs. Another swears the smell of wet clay carries secret messages. You don't roll your eyes because honestly, if you were out here barefoot in the mud every summer, you'd probably start sniffing riverbanks for wisdom too. The scene has a rhythm. Men poke sticks, women haul baskets of reeds. Children giggle while imitating the adults. Life goes on, even if accuracy is questionable. You're witnessing the earliest experiments in hydrology, performed by people with more determination than data. And for all its clumsiness, this process lays the foundation for something far grander: the Nilometer, the stone and water marvel waiting in your near future. For now, though, you watch the farmers stand back, hands on hips, squinting at crooked sticks wobbling in the current. It's not science as you know it, but it's survival. And in that stubborn persistence, you feel the first sparks of human ingenuity flicker like torches in the dark. The villagers poking sticks and floating gourds fade into the background of your memory as you're ushered away by a priest in linen robes. He doesn't waste time with small talk. He simply gestures for you to follow, his sandals slapping against the stones as he leads you toward a temple compound. There, hidden beneath the shadow of a massive pylon gate, lies a staircase that vanishes underground. You descend, cool air brushing your cheeks, and suddenly you find yourself in a cavernous stone shaft. The birth of the Nilometer. Your eyes adjust to the dim light. A narrow channel connects the shaft directly to the Nile. The water seeps in, rising slowly along carved steps. Every ripple sends shimmering patterns across the walls, as if the river itself is sketching hieroglyphs just for you. Here's your mainstream fact. Nilometers were built as early as 3,000 years ago at places like Elephantine Island, Cairo, and Philae. They took different shapes: staircases, columns, or wells, but all served the same purpose: measure the Nile's height precisely in cubits. And here's a quirky tidbit to savor. The cubit itself wasn't a casual meh about this long kind of unit. It was standardized, usually based on the length of a pharaoh's forearm. Imagine tying your economy, your tax system, and your grocery list to the dimensions of someone's elbow. The priest points to faint carvings on the stone, numbers that climb step by step. He murmurs prayers as he notes the water's mark. treating the reading like both science and sacrament. You lean over, trying not to slip, and watch as the waterline kisses a symbol etched centuries ago. It feels like a secret handshake between humans and nature, encoded in stone. Historians still argue whether nilometers were primarily scientific instruments or ritual spaces wrapped in architecture. Was the underground shaft just a big ruler or a temple disguised as one? Standing here, the answer feels obvious. It's both. The quiet echoes, the way sound lingers in the chamber, the flicker of lamplight on water, all of it whispers ceremony. This isn't just data collection, it's communion with a living God. The priest scribbles something on a tablet. You imagine the suspense. A single cubit's difference could tilt Egypt between prosperity and famine. Too low, and fields remain cracked. Too high, and houses dissolve into sludge. Just right, and the land awakens in green glory. The Nilometer is less like a ruler and more like a divine mood ring. You reach down to touch the cool stone wall. Generations have done the same, their fingerprints worn away, but their anxiety still lingers. The Nile's pulse is measured here, year after year, century after century, like a giant slow heartbeat echoing under the earth. A joke slides into your head, uninvited. Imagine today's weather apps if they took this approach. Chance of rain? Please proceed to your underground water temple, consult the elbow measurement inscriptions, and sacrifice an onion. Honestly, maybe more reliable than some forecasts you've seen. As you climb back up the steps, daylight blinds you. The river still flows outside, lazy on the surface. But you know now that deep below, Egypt has built a tool to wrestle with its power. The Nilometer doesn't stop the flood, but it translates its chaos into numbers, and numbers into action. And in that translation, you sense the dawn of something revolutionary. The moment when observation becomes infrastructure, when anxiety becomes architecture. You glance back one last time at the shaft's darkness, where water glimmers faintly. It feels like the Nile is winking at you, as if to say, you can measure me all you want, but I'll always keep a few secrets. And you believe it. You're barely blinking back the sunlight after leaving that underground shaft when the priest waves you toward a shaded courtyard. There, tucked between papyrus scrolls and jars of ink, sit the real power players, the scribes. They're not sweaty farmers guessing with sticks. They're men in crisp linen kilts, brows furrowed, reed pens scratching as carefully as accountants balancing divine checkbooks. Priests and scribes together form Egypt's nervous system of measurement, recording each rise of the Nile like cardiologists charting a heartbeat. Mainstream fact incoming. The temple priests were not just religious figures, they were the empire's scientists. Economists and public relations team rolled into one. When the water rose inside the Nilometer, they logged its exact height in cubits, then used those numbers to forecast crop yields and set taxation rates for the year. It wasn't guesswork, it was systematic, a blend of math, ritual, and raw survival instinct. Quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest priests sometimes spiced their measurements with ritual phrases, muttering invocations as they counted each cubit. Imagine your local accountant reciting poetry while calculating your taxes. That's the energy here. Half spreadsheet, half seance. You sit quietly, pretending you belong, while one scribe dips his pen into black ink and carefully writes 14 cubits. Everyone nods solemnly. You don't know whether that's good or bad, but judging by the slight smirk on another scribe's face, it means this year's going to keep Pharaoh shiny new sandals. Historians still argue whether the priests genuinely believed they were recording sacred messages from the gods, or whether they cynically understood the numbers but wrapped them in religious theater to keep the public awed. Standing here, you feel both possibilities tug at you. The hush of the courtyard makes it feel like holy work, yet the way they tally figures on papyrus has the crisp efficiency of tax accountants. The scribe's hands move with practiced rhythm. Dip, scratch, mutter, nod. The papyrus scrolls pile up like a bureaucratic avalanche. One priest leans over the table and reminds the group that last year's flood fell short, causing lean harvests in the delta. He points at the figures, jabbing his reed pen like a conductor commanding an orchestra. Everyone grimaces. Numbers have long memories, sharper than gossip, and you can't help but notice these men wield power. Farmers may grow the grain, but it's the priests who decide how much everyone owes. And those numbers come straight from the river's whisper inside the Nilometer. A single cubit, more or less, a single line of ink, and entire villages either breathe relief or sink into debt. Imagine your rent fluctuating every year based on river height, and your landlord quoting the gods when you complain. You look up and catch a whiff of incense curling through the air. The scent blends with the scratching of pens and the low hum of chanting. The courtyard becomes a liminal space, half office, half temple. It strikes you that Egypt's stability depended less on Pharaoh's gold mask and more on these men with inky fingers who turned muddy water into written truth. A faint smile creeps onto your lips as you picture a modern parallel. Imagine if weather reports ended with, "The gods have spoken. Your taxes are now 25% higher." Somehow, you suspect fewer people would argue with their utility bills if priests in feathered headdresses were reading them out. Still, the scene has a weight to it. The priest dips his pen again, the scribe rolls up another scroll, and the Nile continues to swell outside. Numbers, prayers, and ink. This is how civilization survives its greatest gamble. And in the steady cadence of reed pens scratching papyrus, you hear not just the sound of writing, but the echo of Egypt's heartbeat, steadying itself for another year. The courtyard fades behind you as the priests shuffle their scrolls into neat bundles. You trail them into a chamber heavy with incense, where the Nile's measurements are no longer just numbers, they're omens. Here, the math of cubits mingles with the moods of gods, and you realize how hard it is to separate faith from figures in ancient Egypt. Mainstream fact: floods weren't interpreted only in practical terms. A level of 16 cubits often meant prosperity, but it also symbolized divine favor, as if Osiris himself had nodded in approval. Too low, and whispers began that the gods were angry. Too high, and rumors spread that chaos, embodied by Seth, had stirred the waters. Numbers weren't just data, they were cosmic emojis. Your quirky tidbit for this round: priests sometimes sprinkled sacred oils or wine into the water while taking readings, believing it sweetened the Nile's temper. That's right, divine hydraulics flavored with Chardonnay. It's half a science experiment, half happy hour. The chamber grows hushed, as one priest declares, 14 cubits this year. Instantly, another interprets, enough for barley, enough for beer, but Pharaoh must honor Hapi with new offerings. You watch the blending of precision and prophecy, the way a measurement becomes a sermon. If you ever doubted how power and religion dance together, this room is your wake-up call, though not too loud, since we're aiming for sleep here. Historians still argue whether the priests truly believed the gods controlled the water, or whether they knowingly used ritual to package science in a way the public would accept. Were they spiritual forecasters or clever PR agents in linen skirts? You lean against a column, listening to debates echo in the smoke, realizing the line between faith and politics was deliberately smudged. You glance toward the open doorway and see farmers waiting outside, craning their necks like nervous parents at a report card ceremony. The priests emerge with their verdict. The flood is generous, the gods are pleased, and cue the collective sigh. The taxes will be higher. Cheers and groans ripple together, because that's Egypt in a nutshell. Joy at abundance tempered by the knowledge that the state will always take its share. The incense coils thicker, and your head swims. You imagine yourself dozing here, lulled by chants and the flicker of lamplight on stone walls. A priest whispers another prayer, voice low and soothing, almost ASMR before microphones existed. For a moment, you think you could drift off right here, wrapped in the ancient blend of mathematics and mysticism. And then the joke hits you. If modern weather apps worked this way, you wouldn't just get 70% chance of rain. You'd get 70% chance Osiris approves, 30% chance Seth is in a mood, taxes definitely due. Honestly, maybe more accurate. You step back into the courtyard as the sun tilts low, painting the river gold. The numbers are written, the gods have spoken, and Egypt braces for another year. Science and faith, side by side, as inseparable as the Nile and its floodplain. And you, lucky witness, carry the weight of both in your ears as the chants fade into evening. The chants fade, incense thins, and before you know it, you're swept along in a small procession toward the granaries. Here, the numbers whispered in smoky chambers harden into the reality of Egypt's least favorite subject, taxes. You might think floodwater only decides whether wheat will grow. In truth, it also decides how much Pharaoh's scribes will knock on your door, smiling politely while they carry very large ledgers. Mainstream fact: the flood measurement at the Nilometer directly set taxation rates. If the waterline hit an ideal level, say 16 cubits, officials predicted bumper harvests and tax quotas rose accordingly. If it fell short, taxes were lighter, but so were your bread rations. The system tied your stomach to your wallet in a way even modern governments might find impressive. Quirky tidbit: records hint that some villagers tried bribing minor officials to adjust the numbers scribbled down from the Nilometer. Imagine slipping a priest a basket of onions to magically shrink the flood reading. Did it work? Who knows? But the fact that people tried tells you everything about human nature. You walk with a cluster of farmers who are less than thrilled. One mutters that the gods must be pleased, because the priests certainly are. They've already announced new temple festivals, conveniently funded by this year's generous flood. Another jokes that if the water rose just 1 cubit less, maybe Pharaoh would have to buy his own sandals for once. The laughter is nervous. Everyone knows jokes about Pharaoh are best whispered, with the river's roar covering your voice. Historians still argue whether the Nilometer was a fair tool for distributing taxes or simply a prop for political control. Was it genuine economic planning or an ancient excuse for revenue grabs? You, eavesdropping here, realize it doesn't really matter. To the villagers, numbers carved on stone were as unchallengeable as the sunrise. You're led through the bustling marketplace, where scribes sit with scrolls unfurled, calculating quotas. A weary farmer leans over the papyrus, pointing at a figure and groaning. But my field is rocky, he protests. The scribe doesn't look up. The river says otherwise, he replies, pen scratching steadily. You feel the absurdity. Water hundreds of miles away in Ethiopia rains down, and suddenly your personal grocery bill triples. And yet, for all the grumbling, people comply. Because the Nile is too sacred and Pharaoh's bureaucracy too sharp to challenge, you imagine yourself standing in line, clutching a basket of barley, muttering about how unfair the flood system is. Basically, you've just invented tax season. A breeze drifts in from the river, carrying the smell of wet reeds and fish. Children chase each other between the tax tables, blissfully unaware that their parents' shoulders slump heavier with every mark on the scrolls. The whole scene feels oddly familiar, like parents at a PTA meeting, resigned smiles hiding financial dread. Your head tilts back, watching kites circle lazily in the sky, and you realize Egypt's genius wasn't just pyramids or mummies. It was transforming a chaotic natural force into a bureaucratic machine, one that ensured Pharaoh's warehouses stayed full. Floods became taxes, taxes became bread, bread became loyalty, and loyalty kept the empire standing. A thought sneaks in, half sarcastic, half true. Maybe the Nile wasn't just Egypt's lifeblood. Maybe it was also the world's first auditor. And trust me, it never missed a cubit. You leave the bustle of the market behind, slipping down a shaded alley that smells faintly of baked bread and damp stone. Ahead, a boy waves you toward another hidden stairwell. This one grander, carved with care, cool to the touch even in the blazing sun. You descend slowly, sandals echoing, until your hand brushes smooth walls marked with precise incisions. Welcome to the architecture of measurement, where stone itself was turned into a ruler for the gods. Mainstream fact: Nilometers came in three main forms: stepwells, vertical columns, and channel basins. The step design, like the one at Elephantine Island, featured stairs leading down to the water, each step etched with cubit marks. Column designs, like the one at Cairo's Rhoda Island, placed a tall pillar in the center of a shaft, inscriptions running up its length to reveal the Nile's mood. And basin styles acted like settling pools, capturing water so priests could measure its clarity and rise. Each was functional, but also strikingly beautiful, proof that even science got dressed up for the gods. Quirky tidbit: some nilometers were decorated with zodiac signs during the later periods, suggesting that people weren't just checking depth, they were also reading their horoscopes while doing it. Imagine measuring tax rates and then learning whether you're a strong Leo on the same column. You trail your fingers along one carved step, noticing how each groove is deep enough to last centuries. This isn't a flimsy, stick in the mud experiment, it's permanence. The walls are cool, damp, faintly smelling of algae. Drops of water echo in the shaft, like a metronome counting time itself. You wonder how many generations of priests trudged down these stairs, oil lamps flickering, hearts thudding as they watched the Nile creep higher. Historians still argue whether the precise architectural flourishes, lotus motifs, symmetrical patterns, carefully polished shafts, were meant as spiritual offerings or simply decorative touches. Were they designed to impress visiting officials or to flatter the gods themselves? Either way, the craftsmanship suggests that measuring the flood was no mundane chore. It was sacred engineering. You pause at a landing and peer down into the gloom. The shaft yawns deep, the water glimmering faintly at the bottom. The boy beside you whispers, "Every step means a life." And he's right. Each carved line carried the weight of bread, taxes, and faith. You press your palm against the stone, feeling the chill seep into your skin, as if the rock itself remembers centuries of nervous hands. For a moment, you imagine modern engineers inspecting this space with hard hats and clipboards. They'd call it elegant, precise, overbuilt, and miss the point entirely. Because this wasn't just about measurement, it was about taming chaos with architecture, translating nature into geometry, building confidence in stone. Your mind drifts back to the farmers poking sticks in the mud. Compared to this shaft, their efforts look like doodles before a masterpiece. And yet, without them, this grand stone ruler wouldn't exist. Trial and error blossomed into enduring architecture. It's humanity's story in miniature. Stumble, fail, improve, immortalize. You climb back up into the sunlight, blinking at the sudden brightness. The shaft's darkness lingers in your mind, though, like a cool shadow you carry with you. You realize you've just seen one of history's quiet wonders, not flashy like pyramids, but just as vital. A staircase that measured not only water, but the fragile line between abundance and disaster. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the water below, still rising, still whispering its slow, muddy secrets to the stones. The stone stairwell fades behind you, and the Nile's open air greets you again, bright, hot, and humming with flies. You wander back toward the villages, where life moves at a slower, dustier rhythm. Here, far from the temple courtyards and priestly columns, you catch a different perspective. The ordinary villagers take on floods. It's less about cubits and taxes, more about gossip, worries, and whispered jokes over baskets of grain. Mainstream fact: most Egyptians were farmers, tied to small plots of land that rose and fell in value with the river's whim. They didn't read papyrus scrolls or consult Nilometer steps. They judged the flood by watching how quickly their fields disappeared underwater or how long the silt stayed wet for planting. Practical observation was their science. If the soil clung to your toes too long, you muttered prayers. If it crumbled dry too quickly, you cursed Seth under your breath. Quirky tidbit: villagers often believed crocodiles carried hidden messages about the flood. If crocodiles lounged lazily on the banks, it meant gentle waters. If they vanished for days, it meant danger. Imagine checking your weather app by peering into the river to see whether your scaly neighbors are sunbathing. You sit among a group of farmers sharing lunch. Flatbread, onions, and beer with the consistency of soup. One man slams his cup down and grumbles. The priests say 16 cubits, but my field says 12. Another chuckles. 16 cubits means 16 sacks taken by the taxman. My donkey refuses to measure anything above 10. The laughter is loud, bitter, but oddly comforting. This is their therapy session. Humor over hardship. Historians still argue whether villagers fully bought into the priestly system or whether they maintained a quiet skepticism, trusting their own mud-stained eyes over temple proclamations. Listening here, you sense both. They respected the gods, sure, but they also rolled their eyes at the bureaucracy. You can almost hear the sarcasm. Oh yes, the gods want more barley this year. How convenient. Children dart past, splashing in shallow pools left by the flood, squealing as fish wriggle between their legs. Women sit weaving mats, their fingers moving steadily as they trade stories. One describes a flood from her childhood so high that crocodiles wandered through the village square. Another recalls a year so dry her family ground weeds into flour just to survive. These memories stick, carried like scars beneath the skin of everyday chatter. The smell of damp straw mixes with smoke from cooking fires. Someone waves a ladle at you and teases, outsider, how many cubits do your feet say this year? You smile nervously, realizing your muddy ankles probably do tell a story. Everyone laughs, because here, measurements aren't just scribbled on stone. They're carved into bodies, fields, and the fragile balance of daily survival. You stretch your legs in the grass and listen. The farmers aren't dismissing the Nilometer. They know it exists, and they know Pharaoh's tax collectors will swear by its numbers. But to them, the real truth is under their nails, in the weight of the soil, in the shine of green sprouts, when the waters finally pull back. For all the grandeur of temples, the flood's meaning is lived most plainly here, where children chase frogs and parents count grain in silence after dark. And just when the moment feels heavy, someone cracks another joke. If the flood rises higher, I'll build a boat and move to Nubia. The group roars with laughter, beer sloshing, worries momentarily drowned. You grin too, realizing humor has always been the most reliable raft in rough waters. The laughter of the farmers trails behind as you wander further along the riverbank. Dusk has begun to slide across the sky, and with it comes the stranger side of flood season, the omens and remedies that feel more like a carnival of superstition than a science fair. This is where human creativity and desperation really shine in the most peculiar ways. Mainstream fact first, ancient Egyptians genuinely believed the Nile was the physical body of the god Hapi, and so offerings were common: bread, fruit, flowers, and sometimes even precious oils were tossed into the water to coax better floods. The annual inundation wasn't just an environmental cycle, it was a sacred drama. Now, for the quirky tidbit, crocodile dung mixed with honey was occasionally smeared on skin as a protective charm against bad waters. Imagine waking up, slathering yourself in reptile poop, and thinking, yes, this is the kind of skincare routine that will keep the Nile calm. It's equal parts dedication and comedy. You sit near a group of villagers gathered in a circle, candles flickering. One woman ties onions to her doorway, muttering that it wards off river demons. Another burns incense until smoke curls like ghostly snakes into the night sky. A boy whispers that if you sleep with a lotus blossom under your pillow, you'll dream of the coming flood's height. He insists his uncle swears by it, though his uncle also swears beer makes him immortal. So, credibility may be shaky. Historians still argue whether these charms were genuinely believed or were simply psychological comforts? Did people really think crocodile dung buttered their chances? Or was it just a way of saying, we've done all we can, now we wait? You watch their faces in the firelight, serious, weary, hopeful, and realize belief doesn't need to be rational to feel real. One farmer lifts a clay jug of beer skyward, shouting, "Too happy, may he rise just enough, not too much, not too little." Everyone laughs nervously, clinking cups. You sip too, the thick, sour liquid coating your tongue like liquid bread. It tastes oddly comforting, like solidarity in a mug. A breeze shifts the smoke, and the smell of incense, onions, and riverweed blends into one pungent cocktail. You stifle a chuckle, thinking you've stumbled into the world's earliest aromatherapy session. A kid sneezes, and his mother smacks his shoulder, hissing, "You'll offend the river." The poor boy looks terrified. Around you, songs begin, low, repetitive chants, the kind that blur into humming. The voices rise and fall like the river itself, creating a rhythm that could lull you straight to sleep. It's soothing, even if the lyrics are basically, "Dear river, please don't ruin everything." And somewhere behind you, frogs croak in a chorus. To the villagers, it's another sign, though whether good or bad depends on who you ask. One elder mutters that the frogs mean happy is laughing. Another insists it means Seth is plotting. You shrug. Either way, the frogs are definitely louder than your fan at bedtime. You lean back in the grass, eyelids heavy as the fire crackles. The Nile flows quietly nearby, reflecting the candlelight like stars scattered on the water. And you realize, for all their odd remedies, charms, and smelly concoctions, the villagers are simply trying to tame uncertainty with whatever tools they have. And really, who can blame them? The night deepens, and you drift a little further along the riverbank. The songs of villagers fade, replaced by the quieter hum of crickets and the steady lap of water. Here, away from both temples and gossip circles, you feel the weight of doubt creep in. For all the sticks in the mud, all the carved stone shafts, all the charms of onions and incense, no one actually knows what the Nile will do. It's a truth that lingers like mist. Humans can measure, pray, and predict, but the river will always keep some secrets. Mainstream fact, even with Nilometers and centuries of records, floods varied wildly. Sometimes rains in Ethiopia were heavy, sending surges roaring down. Other times, drought left fields cracked and brittle. The annual inundation was reliable in timing, but unpredictable in volume, and no measuring system could guarantee certainty. Quirky tidbit: one papyrus account mentions an especially confusing year when the flood rose high, then suddenly receded mid-season, only to return weeks later. Villagers joked that Happy must have gone on holiday, then remembered he left the faucet running. You grin at the thought. Ancient river gods with bad plumbing skills. You recline in the grass, the air thick with moisture, and consider how much authority priests claimed by interpreting the flood. Yet historians still argue whether their role was truly predictive or mostly theatrical. Did their measurements help farmers plan realistically, or were they more about reinforcing Pharaoh's divine control? Was the Nilometer a tool of science, faith, or politics? You picture a scholar, centuries later, poring over temple inscriptions, scratching his head, muttering, were they measuring or just vibes? The debate still hums today. Maybe the priests had a genuine hydrological database. Maybe they staged rituals to keep the population calm. Or maybe, like you staring at a confusing weather radar app, they blended data with guesswork, then sprinkled in some divine branding. The uncertainty becomes its own atmosphere. You imagine being a farmer, lying awake at night, staring at a reed ceiling, wondering if the rising water outside means abundance or ruin. You've done the charms, listened to the priests, checked your field with your own eyes, and still, you don't know. That tension, that what if, was the Nile's greatest power. You roll onto your side, listening to the current's slow gurgle. It's hypnotic, like white noise, but underneath, it hums with menace. You can't shake the thought that whole dynasties toppled when the Nile withheld its gifts. Kings could build pyramids and carve monuments, but when the river shrugged, all that stone turned to dust. And yet, maybe that uncertainty was part of the spell. Egyptians lived in a world where control was never absolute. The flood taught them humility, patience, and maybe even a strange sort of comfort. You do what you can, then surrender to forces larger than yourself. It's not unlike lying in bed now, hoping tomorrow's troubles won't loom too large, trusting the night will carry you through. The moon glints off the water, silver and steady, as if mocking your restless thoughts. The Nile offers no answers, only the eternal reminder that humans, for all their cleverness, will always measure but never master. Dawn finds you farther downstream, where the Nile widens into a mirror of copper light. You rub sleep from your eyes and realize something curious. Egypt isn't the only place wrestling with moody rivers. Beyond the horizon, other civilizations are also scratching their heads, inventing their own tricks to predict water's whims. The Tigris and Euphrates, for example, two siblings notorious for tantrums, kept Mesopotamian farmers in a constant state of will we feast or starve? Deja vu, mainstream fact, Mesopotamians lacked the relatively predictable rhythm of the Nile. Their rivers flooded erratically, sometimes twice in one year, sometimes not at all. To cope, they built levees and canals, essentially an early form of hydraulic engineering. Instead of measuring floods with stone steps, they tried to tame them with dikes. Imagine if Egyptians had tried that here. Pyramid-level projects just to keep their sandals dry. Quirky tidbit. There's evidence that in Babylon, priests sometimes performed rituals with sheep's livers to divine water patterns. Yes, sheep's livers. They believed the organ reflected cosmic messages, including clues about floods. You can't help but chuckle. While Egyptians stared at water lines, Babylonians stared at dinner, both equally convinced they'd cracked the code. As you stroll along the Nile's bank, you picture ancient travelers swapping stories, an Egyptian merchant boasting, "Our Nilometer tells us the God's plan," while a Mesopotamian rolls his eyes, muttering, "Try surviving when your river decides to flood on Tuesdays and Thursdays just for fun." Both men certain their misery was worse, both secretly jealous of the other's predictability. Historians still argue whether Egypt borrowed any ideas from Mesopotamian hydrology, or whether each culture solved problems in isolation. The debate drifts like silt. Were these ancient engineers sharing wisdom along trade routes, or reinventing the wheel, region by region? You imagine a conference of Bronze Age water nerds, swapping tips on canal digging over mugs of warm beer. The Nile glimmers steadily at your feet, calm as if showing off. Compared to the unpredictable twins of Mesopotamia, this river must have felt like a reliable old friend, grumpy at times, but consistent. No wonder Egyptians built entire theologies on it. They could gamble on its rhythm, even if they couldn't control its exact mood. And yet, as you watch a reed boat slip by, its sail snapping in the breeze, you think about how universal this struggle is. Wherever people settled, rivers ruled. Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, different currents, same human anxiety. The search for certainty has always been the same. Build, measure, pray, repeat. You kick a pebble into the water, ripples spreading out like questions with no answers. Maybe you've just stumbled onto the first global truth. Every civilization has its own way of arguing with rivers. Egyptians carved cubits, Mesopotamians sacrificed sheep, and you just hope your Wi-Fi forecast is accurate enough to pack an umbrella. The sun climbs higher, and the river sparkles brighter. Across continents and centuries, floods remain both gift and threat, teacher and tormentor, and in their shared struggle, ancient peoples unknowingly wove the first threads of global wisdom. Trust the river, but never entirely. By mid-morning, the river is busy again. Reed boats gliding, fishermen casting nets, children splashing along the banks. But your thoughts drift forward in time, centuries after pharaohs. When sandals gave way to togas, curious visitors arrived. The Greeks, and later the Romans. To them, Egypt's relationship with the Nile wasn't just practical, it was downright exotic. Mainstream fact: Greek historians like Herodotus marveled at the Nile's floods and the Egyptians' measuring systems. He described the Nilometers with a mix of awe and skepticism, scratching his beard at how a river could rise so predictably while still causing so much drama. Later, Roman administrators inherited the system, using nilometer readings to manage grain shipments bound for the empire's breadbasket. Egypt's floods didn't just feed its own people, they fueled Rome's appetite too. Quirky tidbit: some Roman tourists were convinced the Nile's annual flood was caused by snow melting in Africa. Imagine sweaty legionaries, cloaks stuck to their backs, insisting, oh yes, clearly snow is the answer. While staring at a sun-baked desert horizon, you stroll into a vision of Greek scholars standing at the edge of a nilometer, scribbling notes on wax tablets. One mutters, ingenious, while another grumbles that it's all smoke and mirrors. A Roman tax collector nearby just shrugs. He doesn't care how it works, only that it tells him how much grain to seize. Historians still argue whether these later outsiders truly understood the Egyptians' blend of science and ritual, or whether they reduced it to paperwork. Were they impressed by the sacred geometry, or simply glad someone else had done the math for them? You imagine a Greek philosopher debating whether the Nile's rise reflected cosmic balance, while a Roman bureaucrat interrupts, yes, yes, balance. But how many sacks of wheat can we ship to Ostia? The scene shifts in your mind. Merchants at Alexandria's bustling port, amphorae clinking, ships creaking under the weight of grain. The Nilometer's measurements, carved quietly in stone upriver, ripple all the way here, feeding empires far beyond the Egyptian horizon. You realize the Nile's numbers became an invisible empire in themselves, bridging deserts, filling bellies, propping up distant thrones. A breeze stirs, and you catch the faint scent of tar and salt as ships set sail. You can almost hear the chatter, Greek accents, Roman orders, Egyptian prayers, all circling around the same ancient problem: how to read the moods of a river. And you chuckle softly because whether in temples, forums, or Senate halls, the conversation always comes down to the same sleepy truth. Water levels equal bread, and bread equals power. You glance back at the Nile, steady and shimmering, and think even the conquerors couldn't conquer the river. They could only measure, negotiate, and adapt, just like everyone before them. Centuries slide by as you linger on the riverbank, and the scene shifts again. Pharaohs are long gone, Rome's banners have faded, but the Nile still swells and recedes, stubborn as ever. It's now the era of medieval Islam, and Arab engineers and scholars step into the story, scratching their heads at the same old puzzle: how to measure a river that refuses to be tamed. Mainstream fact: during the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly in the 9th century, Arab rulers repaired and expanded Nilometers, most famously the one on Rhoda Island in Cairo. Caliph al-Mutawakkil even ordered renovations so precise that inscriptions in both Arabic and older scripts still survive today. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were active instruments for setting tax rates and planning irrigation centuries after their original construction. Quirky tidbit: some records suggest local officials announced flood measurements publicly in Cairo, almost like a ceremony. Picture a crowd gathering as a herald reads the water level, people cheering or groaning as though it were the ancient equivalent of stock market news. The Nile rose 17 cubits. Cue applause, anxiety, and maybe a few side bets at the coffee stall. You wander into a reimagined medieval Cairo, the air buzzing with merchants' calls, camels groaning under loads of spices, and the ever-present shimmer of the river in the background. An imam leans over the edge of the Nilometer shaft, murmuring prayers, while an engineer jots notes on parchment. Faith and mathematics once again sit shoulder to shoulder, sipping from the same ladle. Historians still argue whether the Islamic rulers valued the Nilometer primarily as a scientific tool or as a political spectacle. Was it about genuinely informing agricultural policy, or about showing the people that the caliph's hand stretched all the way into the river's depths? You suspect it was both, a reminder that rulers could translate muddy water into social order. The marketplace chatters around you. A baker clutches flour-dusted hands and mutters, "If the reading is high, bread will be plenty. If it is low, better hide your coin." Nearby, a fisherman shakes his head. Numbers can lie. Only fish tell the truth. You smile at the timeless grumble. Same skepticism, different century. A breeze off the river cools your face as you realize how the Nilometer itself became a palimpsest of civilizations. Egyptian carvings, Roman notes, Arabic inscriptions, all layered on the same stone, like a history book written in watermarks. Each era added its own ink, yet all bowed to the same reality. The Nile decided, humans merely translated. You picture a crowd dispersing after the latest measurement announcement, gossip swirling like dust. Some laugh, some groan, some pray. The river flows on, indifferent, while rulers and villagers alike cling to numbers as if they were lifelines, and maybe they were. The call to prayer drifts over the city, soft and melodic, blending with the splash of oars on the Nile. You lean against a column, eyelids heavy, thinking, centuries change, languages change, but the conversation with the river never ends. The call to prayer fades, merchants close their stalls, and shadows lengthen across Cairo. You wander once more to the Nile's edge, and for the first time in this long journey, the story tilts toward the present. The ancient rhythms are still there, pulsing under the water, but now they're hidden beneath concrete, satellites, and the vast presence of the Aswan High Dam. The river that once dictated everything from bread rations to temple hymns now hums under turbines measured not by cubits but by spreadsheets and satellites. Mainstream fact: today, the Nile's flow is managed through modern engineering, dams, reservoirs, and irrigation systems. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, essentially ended the natural annual flood cycle that had defined Egypt for millennia. For the first time in recorded history, the Nile no longer swells and recedes with predictable drama. Crops thrive year-round, but the ancient silt deposits that enrich the soil are mostly gone. Progress, with a pinch of irony, quirky tidbit, modern researchers use satellite imagery to study water levels and soil moisture, turning what once required underground stone shafts into something you can check on a laptop. Imagine telling a priest from Elephantine, "Yes, we measure the Nile from space now." His linen headdress would probably fall right off in shock. Historians still argue whether Egypt lost something intangible when the floods were tamed. Was it simply progress, or did controlling the river cut Egyptians off from a ritual rhythm that bound them together for thousands of years? The debate lingers, like ripples fading from a stone cast long ago. You sit quietly, watching neon lights reflect on the Nile's surface, the hum of car horns replacing the chants of priests. Yet under the glitter, you sense continuity. Villagers still gossip about water shortages. Farmers still pray for steady irrigation. Governments still argue about who controls the river's flow. The tools have changed, but the tension remains. Water equals life, power, and endless debate. A cool breeze brushes your cheek, and the sound of the river becomes softer, more lullaby than lecture. The Nile whispers the same song it has for thousands of years, whether through crocodile dung charms, stone nilometers, or satellite data. And as you lean back, heavy-eyed, you realize you've walked through millennia of human worry, invention, and hope, all carried on the shoulders of one muddy river. The water shimmers, slower now, as if easing you into stillness. Picture yourself lying on the bank, stars overhead, a hush settling across the landscape. The questions quiet down. The priests, the farmers, the engineers, they all step back, leaving only the sound of water lapping gently against stone. Your breath falls into rhythm with the current. Each inhale, a slow rise. Each exhale, a gentle fall. Like the flood itself, predictable, soothing, eternal. You feel your body soften, the weight of centuries sliding away. The frogs croak faintly in the distance. The air carries a cool sweetness, and the Nile's lullaby folds around you like a blanket. You drift with the river's memory of cubits carved in stone, of incense burning in courtyards, of scribes muttering numbers. of villagers laughing nervously in the dark. All of it fades into a soft hum, timeless and reassuring. The river has seen famine and feasts, kings and commoners, rituals and revolutions, and through it all, it still flows. So let yourself flow too. Set down the worries you carried here. Close your eyes to the flickering lamplight of history. Let the Nile carry you gently, steadily into sleep.